Welcome to part one of the series on intermittent fasting and metabolic health. My name is Eric Williamson, and I'm the owner of the nutrition coaching company, Unlocked Fitness and Nutrition. I'm also a registered dietitian, and I'm currently pursuing my PhD in the area of exercise, nutrition, and metabolism. Today, we're going to dive into intermittent fasting and its effects on adipose tissue and fat loss. I've attempted to make this presentation an educational resource for practitioners, scientists, and the public alike. This being said, there is some academic terminology, otherwise known as jargon, used throughout. I'll be doing my best to define each term, but if you are unsure what a particular word or acronym is referring to, please see the notes section below this video for a description. Here's exactly what you are going to know by the end. With this being the first part of the series, we are going to start by defining intermittent fasting and its different types. We will briefly discuss broadly how it influences metabolism of different substrates and nutrients. And then we will look at if, how, and when intermittent fasting may lead to reduced body weight, particularly body fat. At the very basic level, intermittent fasting is the abstinence of food or caloric fluid for an intentional period of time. Many would define fasting as the consumption of water or pure caffeine. However, some would say that pure caffeine alters metabolism, so it is not fasting. The middle blue area of the circles is where some researchers and practitioners would still consider fasting and others would not. And then the right side is examples of what would be generally accepted across the board as not fasting. Intermittent fasting can then be subdivided into three subtypes. The first one is alternate day fasting, or ADF. This is alternating between ad libitum feeding days and fasting days, which typically consist of a single meal. Next is whole day fasting, or WDF, which is either complete fasting or very low caloric intake 1 to 2 days per week. A common example of this is the 5-2 diet, where individuals fast for 2 days per week and eat normally the other 5 days. Lastly, and most popular, is time-restricted feeding, where there's a fasting window and a feeding window, such as 16-8, where an individual would fast for 16 hours and restrict their eating window to 8 hours. Then this can be further subdivided down into ETRF, which is an earlier feeding window closer to waking hours. This will be more important for part 2, where we discuss IF's effects on carbohydrate metabolism and insulin sensitivity. Here's an overview of what occurs with fasting. Generally, blood glucose, which is our primary blood carbohydrate, these levels decline, insulin declines, lipolysis, which is the breakdown of our body's fat stores to make fatty acids available, increases, and fat oxidation, which is a measure of the use of fat for energy, increases. In the graph, glycogenolysis is the breakdown of our body's glycogen or carbohydrate stores into glucose to be made available for fuel use. It comes down very rapidly, as you can see, at the onset of fasting, because these stores quickly become depleted. The liver stores in particular are depleted over approximately 24 hours. Lipolysis and ketogenesis increases. Lipolysis releases free fatty acids, which they themselves can be used by tissues for fuel, but other tissues can't use these, so some free fatty acids need to be converted to ketones. And then gluconeogenesis is the making of glucose by the body, and that rises and then comes back down a little bit once ketogenesis and lipolysis reach sufficient levels to meet demands. However, it never completely turns off, as certain organs still require glucose and the blood itself requires glucose. If we had a blood glucose level of 0, we would be dead. Keep in mind, this is over days of fasting, but our understanding of this will help us to understand what occurs with intermittent fasting. Here's what happens when someone goes from eating normally compared to someone who starts fasting over hours. Their respiratory quotient drops, which indicates greater fat oxidation or greater use of fat as a fuel. Then this is what happens to substrate fuel use over days. Carbohydrate utilization drops rapidly, but again, never reaches 0. Fat and ketone production ramp up, and protein is an interesting one that rises initially, but then falls. We'll be discussing that one more in particular during part 3 on IF's effect on muscle. These are our primary organs of focus throughout the three parts. Adipose tissue in the fasted state experiences lipolysis to release free fatty acids into the bloodstream. In muscle, protein breakdown primarily occurs, releasing amino acids. These free fatty acids and amino acids can then enter the liver. Here, glycogenolysis occurs, which becomes rapidly depleted. The amino acids are primarily used for gluconeogenesis, but there are some amino acids that are ketogenic and can be made into ketones. And the free fatty acids are primarily used for ketogenesis. This then allows ketones and glucose to be released into the blood and be used by other organs. For this part of the series, we are going to be primarily focusing on what happens with adipose tissue, and we're going to approach this in the form of a question. Does the enhancement in lipolysis lead to body fat losses, or is there some other contributing factor that results in weight loss? Let's start with a top-level overview of adipose tissue metabolism. This is what will be primarily occurring during the fasting window. Lipolysis, the breakdown of fat, releases free fatty acids. These can be converted to ketones to be used for energy, and the free fatty acids themselves can also be used for energy. During feeding, energy or calorie intake can affect adipose cells by increasing triglycerides and free fatty acids in the blood. De-Novo Lipogenesis, or the body making fat, can also occur, such as the conversion of carbohydrates to free fatty acids. These free fatty acids can then be esterified and stored in adipose tissue as triglycerides. There are a few different scenarios that can occur with IF. One is if the energy expenditure as a result of the fasting window exceeds energy intake over 24 hours, then the net result would be fat loss. Another possibility is if perhaps energy intake during the feeding window were to become greater than energy expenditure, such as if the person were to consume more calorically dense foods or become hungrier as a result of the fasting, then the net result could actually be fat gain. Lastly, if no difference in energy expenditure and intake were to occur, such as if you have no difference from prior fasting, or if both were to increase or decrease to the same degree, then there would be no difference in body fat levels. So really, body fat balance, loss or gain, is dependent on energy intake and energy expenditure rather than what fuels are being oxidized. In other words, an increase in fat oxidation does not mean there will be an increase in body fat loss. Please do not get those two things confused. I'd like to also look at this another way. Some proponents of intermittent fasting will suggest that the advantage of IF is a reduction in insulin levels. In other words, each time we eat, insulin is released, which stimulates fat formation. And when we fast, we get fat loss due to reduced insulin. Therefore, if we were to fast for longer, such as by cutting out a meal, this would reduce our exposure to insulin and thus reduce insulin-stimulated fat formation while increasing fat loss. This is what is purported anyways. Coming back to the adipose tissue mechanism, this proposition really rests on what is known as the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity. This theory states that carbs increase insulin. Insulin shuts down the rate-limiting enzyme for adipose tissue breakdown, which is hormone-sensitive lipase. You will see sometimes figures like this depict an X, such as what is shown here. However, more correctly, it just slows it down drastically, so there's less lipolysis occurring. Also, insulin increases activity of the rate-limiting enzyme for fat formation, being lipoprotein lipase, driving more fat into the cell. There are a number of issues with this theory, though. One that is important to remember is that carbs only explain so much of the story when it comes to insulin. There are many factors in whole foods that can affect the temporal pattern as well as the magnitude of insulin response, including fiber, water, and gut hormones known as incretins. Also, another one largely is protein. Protein can be highly insulin stimulating. Some proteins like dairy, beef, and fish that are very high in branched chain amino acids are highly insulin stimulating and even more so than many carbohydrate based foods. Also, one of the biggest misconceptions regarding insulin is that it is needed for fat storage. In fact, fat intake can also affect these processes. Because it is a substrate for LPL, it can increase its enzymatic activity. Then, because it is a product of the HSL reaction, it can decrease its activity. I would like to come back to this image and correct it. Instead of insulin stimulating fat formation, this would be more correctly defined as macronutrient, that is, carbs, fat, and protein stimulated fat formation. Instead of fat loss due to reduced insulin, this is more correctly fat loss due to energy expenditure. At the end of the day, it is going to be the balance of these two processes that dictate body fat changes. Yes, if lipolysis exceeds adipogenesis, the result will be body fat loss. Put more simply, if the amount of light blue area signifying gain is less than the amount of darker blue area signifying loss, then over time, body fat losses will be the result. Another scenario is if an individual were to have a large caloric intake over those two meals that they do have, and the stimulated fat formation exceeds energy expenditure induced fat loss, then this would result in body fat gain. Lastly, if the area under the curve for the blues in loss and gain are the same, then there will be no change in body fat levels. To zoom out even further and really bring this one home, body fat balance, loss or gain, comes down to caloric intake and caloric expenditure. Therefore, just as we would expect, experimental evidence and studies such as what is shown in this meta-analysis forest plot, they show here that there's no difference in the rate of weight loss when compared to other forms of caloric deficiency. There's no difference in RCT weight loss outcomes for IF compared to continuous energy restriction. Meaning, if someone were in a 500 calorie deficit because of IF, and another person were in a 500 calorie deficit because of reduced portions, they would lose weight at the exact same rate. However, what about when individuals are only told to implement intermittent fasting and not given any other direction with their nutrition? In other words, they have an ad libitum intake or eating freely, you might say. Well, meta-analyses show, such as this forest plot on the right, that they do indeed lose weight when compared to controls or compared to baseline. Generally, what we see is that over 8 to 12 weeks, body weight declines before plateauing. This weight loss is on average about 1 to 4% with TRF and 4 to 8% with ADF or WDF. And this is meaningful too, as the greatest benefits of reduced body weight on metabolic health when individuals do have any concerns is about 5%. It's important to ask why this is. Why do individuals typically lose weight when following IF? Well, it turns out that humans are not good at compensating for missed meals or missed days in the short term. This study to the left took a group of individuals and had them eat a controlled maintenance diet one day. Then the day after, they either ate ad libitum, so freely, or fasted for the entire day and didn't eat for 36 hours until the morning the day after. This data here then shows what their ad libitum calorie intake was after a day of eating as they pleased or after a day of complete fasting. What we see is that the day after a fast, they do indeed eat more by about 500 calories. However, this is nowhere close to how much they eliminated by not eating the day prior. If you average the calorie deficit between the 2 days, it works out to be an average deficit of about 570 calories per day. The same thing can be said for eliminating breakfast as well. In this study, when individuals skipped breakfast and then ate ad libitum the rest of the day, they did eat more later, particularly at lunch, but not nearly enough to make up for how much they eliminated by not eating breakfast. And this resulted in a 450 kcal deficit across the day. Now, there is a bit of a caveat to this, as a study published by James et al. In September 2020 shows that there is a bit of an anticipatory effect to fasting. On the day prior, individuals tend to increase their intake, and they also reduce their energy expenditure both before and during an alternate day fasting day. This means that there are psychological factors at play here that would result in the actual average being a little bit less than what is suggested in studies like these. In a lot of research, what is published is averages. Fortunately, in this well-done 12-week study from Ethan Weiss's lab, the individual results were given. This was a free-living ad libitum study where the TRF participants ate between noon and 8 p.m. And what we see is that there is a large amount of variability in how they responded. Even though the average response is a reduction in weight, there are those who didn't lose any weight at all, and also those who gained weight as a result of TRF. Perhaps these participants had higher hunger later in the day, resulting in them eating more. Maybe they chose more calorically dense foods. They could have reduced their activity levels. There's a study known as the University of Bath Breakfast Project, where they tracked individuals after either skipping breakfast or not skipping breakfast, and found that when people skip breakfast, they move around a lot less in the morning. Lastly, and this is an interesting one, is maybe it just wasn't a novel stimulus. There's a very interesting study that was done in 1992 by Schlunt et al., simply titled The Role of Breakfast in the Treatment of Obesity. They had breakfast skippers either skip or eat breakfast, and then they had regular breakfast eaters either skip or eat breakfast. Those who lost the most weight were the ones that changed their routine the most, as in when the ones who usually skip ate breakfast and the ones who usually ate breakfast skipped, they lost the most weight. It seems a novel stimulus can have powerful effects. Now, in this study here, they did screen participants to ensure they usually ate breakfast at the onset of the study, but perhaps in the past, some of the ones who didn't lose weight had been breakfast skippers and it wasn't new and novel to them. To summarize, enhancements in fat oxidation and reductions in insulin do not equate to greater body fat losses. IF is equally as effective as other forms of calorie restriction. TRF alone on an ad libitum diet results in an average of 1 to 4% weight loss. Whole day fasting and alternate fit day fasting on an ad libitum diet results in about 4 to 8% weight loss. IF may be a simple means of inducing energy deficiency in the short term without needing to control other diet variables such as portions. Based on this, here's my interpretation and recommendations. If someone's goal is fat loss, IF can be a possible tool if it fits with their lifestyle and if they find their hunger is better managed with IF than other forms of caloric deficiency. Do keep in mind that individual results will vary. If you look at studies on ad libitum intake, you will actually see that even though the average is weight loss, some individuals do gain weight when put on IF, and these are likely the moderating factors here. these 2 points. In a real world setting, having a cutoff in the evening time rather than the morning may be more effective. This is for 2 main reasons. One is that after dinner tends to be the time where calorically dense, quote unquote, junk foods tend to be consumed. By limiting these, it can help individuals maintain the calorie deficit. And 2, research demonstrates that those who skip breakfast tend to be less active. Keep in mind that it should be used alongside exercise, and we'll talk more about that in part 3. Mental health and relationships with food should be closely monitored. Being so restrictive, especially if limiting to only 1 or 2 meals in the evening time, can result in quite ravenous levels of hunger, especially over time. When the individual does eat, the food can be very hyperpalatable, resulting in rapid consumption and can make calorically dense foods like, quote unquote, junk foods very tempting. This can then lead to a risk of feelings of disinhibition, disordered eating, and a binge restrict cycle. I'd like to remind you here that weight loss comes with risks. There are some minor physical health risks, but there are some major mental health risks, such as negative relationships with food and a person's body. Because of these, it is not advised that anyone ever try to lose weight on their own without help of a trained practitioner. And this is especially when people are limiting to 1 to 2 meals with intermittent fasting for that binge restrict cycle reason that I gave. Athletes or those who do high volumes of exercise should be cautioned, and so should older individuals. These will both be discussed further in part 3. As a preview for part 2 on insulin sensitivity and metabolic disease, if we look at these metabolic benefits that have been seen across studies in humans, particularly the green arrows as the red arrow for fasting triglycerides may be a downfall of IF, we see that these are also effects that occur with weight loss. Many recent studies have been trying to tease apart whether these effects can occur independent of weight loss, or if those who lose weight have even greater health benefits with IF as opposed to another approach. This is what we'll be covering in part 2, which is a very interesting discussion, so be sure to stay tuned.